Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined again. I guess 4 months ago, we had our first conversation by Whit Ayres, the well-known Republican and deservedly well-known and well-respected Republican pollster and strategist, head of North Star Opinion Research. Whit's worked on many Senate campaigns, a couple of presidential campaigns, Lamar Alexander. I think that's where we got to know each other reasonably well back in '96, I guess that was. And then the abortive 2000 campaign. We'll come back and talk maybe a little bit about the lessons of that. Marco Rubio's campaign. Whit has a PhD in political science. I should mention that. But despite that, is extremely sensible and intelligent about all matters political and electoral. So Whit, thanks for joining me again.
Bill, great to be with you again. Always enjoy it.
Our conversation, we were now speaking at the end of November 28th. We spoke on August 4th, so almost 4 months ago. And that conversation, I look back at it, stands up pretty well, I think, in terms of what would happen in the midterms. But now we have 2 years till a presidential election, and a pretty important and eventful one. And I thought we could begin to help people think through what's going to happen over these next 2 years, insofar as that's predictable, if that's okay.
Surely.
I don't know how predictable it is, but you've been through this before, and you understand what happens in the off year, the odd numbered year before the actual presidential year. So let's talk about that. And let's begin with the Republicans. I mean, what is the state of play, do you think, right now for the Republican nomination? How has it changed from what you might have expected back when we spoke almost 4 months ago?
Well, this is an odd-numbered year, and is going to be a particularly odd-numbered year,
Yeah, right.
Because we have never before had a former president who is a leading candidate for his party's nomination in 2024. The midterms came out just about what we expected, Bill. We never saw the evidence for the red tsunami that a lot of people were talking about. You know, my colleagues and I were looking at each other in the last week or so before the election going, are they seeing something we're not seeing? Because we don't see it out there in the numbers. The Senate races just look so tight that they really were a coin flip. We expected the House to go Republican, but we didn't know by how much. So all in all, it turned out about the way we expected, although the Republicans had an even more disappointing year, I think, than we thought going in. They left a lot of seats on the table, and it was primarily due to two factors. One was the Dobbs decision that really did energize a lot of Democrats, particularly women and younger people. Abortion was a number one issue for voters under 30, for example. And the other one, the major factor, is the nomination of a whole lot of very weak, inexperienced, first-time MAGA-aligned election-denying candidates. It turns out that trying to overturn an election is not wildly popular with the American people, and they rejected MAGA-aligned election-denying candidates across the board, state after state after state. So for those of us who hope for reasonable and rational center-right governance, I suppose that was a positive step, but I'd rather see reasonable, rational Republicans in control than Democrats.
So how much do you think, do you think it was significant that the election deniers, the most MAGA candidates, were defeated, whereas other Republicans had a decent night, not a great night for a midterm, but they did win the national popular vote by a point or two, it looks like. Depends how you adjust for uncontested seats and so forth. And but they certainly did better than they had done in 2020 or 2018. So in that respect, probably better than they did in 2016, actually, if you add up the national House vote. So, it wasn't a disastrous night for Republicans.
No.
And do you think Republicans have internalized that? How much does that lesson spill over, I guess, going forward? That's a big question. How much is the notion of the Republicans paid a price for Trump and to some degree for Trumpiness? Is that something Republican voters, Republican elites understand, want to understand, don't want to understand, will understand?
Well, those are two different questions, Bill, about Republican voters and Republican elites.
Well, let's talk about that then. Yeah.
Republican elites, the donors, the elected officials, the people who run things, understand very well that Donald Trump was a primary cause for Republicans losing 3 elections in a row in 2018 and 20 and 22. And they kind of understand that there's no education in the fourth kick of a mule. So they are looking around for some opportunities for another candidate to run. But they're not going to say that because they're scared about getting ripped up by Donald Trump and or his minions. And so they're not going to be public about that very often. What we've got to do is look at the actions of state parties and the RNC rather than the words. And those actions involve things like how they structure their presidential primary in 2024. If you see a bunch of state parties that are going to a convention setup or continue to have winner take all primaries where you get a third of the vote, you get 100% of the delegates, you can be pretty well assured that those state parties and the RNC are lining up foursquare behind Donald Trump. On the other hand, if you see some actions that look different than that they go more to, say, winner take all by congressional district or proportional representation like the Democrats have, where you get a third of the vote, you get a third of the delegates, then you'll know that the organization is trying to open the door to an alternative to Trump. But you're going to have to pay attention to the actions those parties take rather than the words that come out, because they're simply not going to publicly criticize Donald Trump.
So that's all very interesting. So a couple of questions then. I mean, one, where do you think the Republican National Committee and the state parties are right now in terms of balance of power or, willingness to adjust things in a way that's a little less favorable to Trump, or I suppose conceivably a little more favorable to Trump if they start closing primaries and making it harder for people to get on the ballot other than Trump and so forth? And then what other elites matter before we get to the voters who matter? Presumably it's a dynamic process, right? The elites look at the polls of the voters, and the voters get shaped a little bit by the elite discourse, I guess. Maybe not. Maybe there's just a split between them. But anyway, talk a little bit about, I mean, what do you think about the state parties and the RNC, and what about other sort of Republican and conservative elites, and what do they want and how much power do they have to make what they want happen?
Well, Bill, we may need to redefine the term Republican establishment. That used to mean people like Mitch McConnell and some of the senators. But the Republican establishment today is a Trump establishment. The Trump forces have thoroughly taken over the RNC and most of these state parties. And so you would expect those organizations, if they stay loyal to Donald Trump, to pass laws or establish primary rules that would favor Donald Trump. The other elites are a different story. They're the donors who are pretty frustrated, having lost 3 elections in a row. And they are very interested in some alternative candidates. Whether or not that affects Republican voters remains to be seen. We talked in August about the tripartite division of the Republican Party between never Trump voters of somewhere around 10%, always Trump voters somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, and maybe Trump voters in the 50 to 60% range. Those people who supported him twice would vote for him again over Joe Biden, but are not sure they want to go back to all the drama and division, and they're open to another candidate. I would love that. Those were the divisions as of last summer. I would love to do an update of those divisions post midterm election. In fact, if any of your listeners want to fund it, I'm happy to go back in and update that. But it's going to be interesting for me to see if there's any real change in those proportions. If there's not a real change,
what do you expect? I mean, what would you guess?
If past is prologue, Bill, you'd have to assume that the always Trump faction is going to remain in that 30 to 40% range, which we may recall from 2015, 2016. Donald Trump rarely got more than a third of the Republican primary vote. in the early primaries. It wasn't until after he wrapped up the nomination that he started getting a majority of the vote. So if he continues to get in that 30 to 40% range, and there are multiple candidates splitting up the non-Trump vote and a lot of winner-take-all primaries, he's in a very strong position to get renominated.
Maris did a poll that you probably saw in mid-November. So this is after the midterm. And on the one hand, it showed erosion in Trump's support. So the question was, do you think Republicans have a better chance of winning in 24 if Trump is the nominee or if someone else is? So that's, I think, a good way of asking the question, though I'd be curious what you think of it, because it doesn't, allows you to be okay with Trump, but just dubious that he's the best nominee. It doesn't ask you to be never Trump or critical of Trump's presidency particularly. So that poll a year ago was Trump 50%, someone else 35%. That is, people thought Trump had a better chance. That poll 2 weeks ago was Trump 35%, someone else 54%. And that 35 seems to be absolutely in the middle of your 30 to 40 range of kind of always Trump. And I guess, so does that seem, so that would suggest that the sometimes Trump people are pretty open to a alternative nominee, right? If that's
they definitely are, but it's that 35% that you just quoted that's the challenge, and I'm going to be watching that number to see if it goes below the 30% that we talked about in August. If it does, then Donald Trump's in real trouble. But if it doesn't, then his core base of support is going to swing a lot of weight in the primaries come 2024.
And do you think the silence, which you mentioned from the party operatives, senator, elected officials, I suppose, donors as well, kind of wishing things to change, but not being willing to stick their heads above the parapet? I mean, how much does that matter? You could argue, okay, that's fine. They don't need to speak out in November of 2022. They just need to send money to DeSantis or someone else, or not send money to Trump, or quietly tell senators not to get on board with, or members of the House to get on board with Trump, and have quiet meetings with governors in some of the key states. I mean, how much? So this is the invisible primary in that odd numbered year that you've been through a couple of times, and it can be pretty powerful or it can be pretty ineffectual, I guess, right? And also and to get back to your original point, we're also in a different world with Trump. So talk a little bit about how this could play out and what to look for over this next year in that respect.
That invisible primary is really important. It's really important for fundraising. It's really important for eventually name recognition. But it's interesting to think about how that invisible primary would play out and how much of a hold Trump still has on that group. If that group coalesces around an alternative, it can be pretty powerful. We both are old enough to recall the 1999 period. George W. Bush had just won a thumping reelection in a mega state of Texas, and the Republican donors and the Republican leaders at that point kind of decided that this was the guy, that we were going to rally around him. There were other candidates in 2000, but they couldn't get a handle on enough operatives or enough money to be effective. And so the Republican Party sort of decided that these other elites you're talking about decided in 1999 that George W. Bush was going to be the nominee. And sure enough, he was. He raised the most money, he got the most votes, and he ultimately won the presidency.
But there was no Trump, of course.
There was no Trump, of course.
But just on 99, to take a minute on that, which you and I remember well, I mean, people do sort of assume, well, of course, Bush was going to be the nominee. He was the son of the previous president, governor of Texas, just reelected, et cetera, well liked in the party, kind of in the center of the party in terms of his positions, presumably, and sort of profile. But of course, there were serious people who ran, explored running in 99. And I think a few of them even announced, whether it was Elizabeth Dole or Dan Quayle, my former boss, or Laura Alexander, whom you were working for, who ran a good race in 96 and fallen a bit short to Bob Dole. And, it wasn't inevitable. But by the end of 99, all those people dropped out before any votes were cast in a primary or at an Iowa caucus. So that can happen, right? You can have a real consolidation. And I suppose DeSantis is the George W. could be the George W. Bush of this cycle in this scenario.
It sort of feels that way, Bill, that if people want an alternative to Trump, that DeSantis just won a major reelection as governor of a mega state. He's developed national name recognition that George W. Bush had because his last name was Bush and because of his dad. So he's in a position to consolidate that non-Trump vote, assuming he does well in 2023, governs well, continues to attract Republican support. Now, there'll be plenty of other candidates who are talking about running. But the real question is whether DeSantis is able to consolidate that 2/3 or so of the Republican Party that is looking for an alternative.
And you've seen many politicians in your day. I mean, do you have any tentative judgment? I mean, so the two strikingly opposite scenarios would be he's a talented politician, as George W. Bush was, which is kind of what the party mostly would want. Bush had a serious challenge from McCain as an insurgent, but beat it back. So again, it's not comparable to Trump, but let's just bracket that for a minute. Or is DeSantis, as some people have speculated, Scott Walker, who was also a successful governor in an important state, who had been weathered a recall and then been reelected, I guess, by the end of 2014, in a tough state, in a swing state, then more of a Democratic state, really, an Obama state, and who turned out never made it to the starting gate in he said he was running for a few months and then I think pulled out in September. So, I mean, yeah, so is DeSantis Scott Walker? Is DeSantis George W. Bush? How could one even begin to make some preliminary judgments on that, I guess?
No, well, we did the polling for DeSantis when he first ran for governor in 2018. I will tell you, he's very bright, very adept politician. And if you make me choose, I say he's a lot closer to George W. than to Scott Walker.
No, that's interesting. That's important. So I guess it comes back sort of to the Trump question. I mean, how the wild cardness of having Trump there, what could affect? I mean, there could just be erosion, I suppose, in the polls. What hurts him the most? The meeting with neo-Nazi, basically, this guy Fuentes in Mar-a-Lago. Is it that? Is it the conceivable problems with the Justice Department? Is it just a sense that we need a fresh face? I mean, which of those do people have to speak up at some point to get voters to begin eroding or not? I mean, what's your sense of how that plays out?
Dinner with Nick Fuentes is no more damaging than calling the folks in Charlottesville very fine people on both sides. If that were going to erode Donald Trump's support in that 30 to 40%, it would have already. The real question mark for me remains what happens with the Fulton County prosecutor and what happens with Merrick Garland. I think an indictment would cause at least an initial surge of support for Trump, sort of a rally around the former president. It puts all the Republican candidates who might run against him in a position of having to say, this is a political persecution. It's, got nothing to do with the rule of law. It makes them come around and defend him. But what I
think they would? I mean, there'd be, except for the
I think
Liz Cheney types, if there are any like that.
Right. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger won't. But the vast majority of people who have talked seriously about running will, I think, be forced to say this is political persecution. But what I wonder about, Bill, is if this really enhances the desire of the maybe Trump people to find an alternative. I can see Chris Christie maybe saying, do you really want a once indicted, twice impeached, 3-time loser as your nominee? I think that may enhance the desire of the maybe Trump people to find somebody else because it will increase their doubts that the man is electable in 2024.
So there are the always Trump people, and you've pointed out that sort of matters whether they're at 40 or 32 or 27, presumably just as a practical matter, right, in terms of percentage of the Republican primary electorate, and it would obviously differ in different states and so forth. But then those maybe Trump people, some number of them are maybe Trump and kind of like Trump, and some of them are maybe Trump and really would like to get beyond Trump. And I guess the internal division of maybe Trump, how acquiescent to Trump the maybe Trump people are, matters a lot too, right? Because it's sort of in terms of polling and support and donations, it makes a big difference. I think it would make a difference of sort of how against Trump those people are. In 2016, they turned out not to be that. Once Trump won some primaries, they were willing to go with that gamble, I guess. And I guess I don't know how much. I guess that's something hard to judge until you actually get to primaries, right?
It's hard to judge without knowing what the alternative is, too, or who the alternatives are. So you really won't be able to determine that. But the fundamental reason will not be, as the never Trumpers want it to be, that right. Donald Trump is, not fit for the presidency. The rationale for the maybe Trumpers will be that he's going to have a hard time getting elected, and he's going to drag other Republicans down with him. It'll be more the electability argument that'll drive them than any sort of assessment of his fitness for office.
And I suppose that can be either helped or not helped by polls that show that he's not as strong a candidate against Biden or other Democrats. I mean, so far it's just too early. I think there've been a couple of polls that don't show much one way or the other, I think.
Right.
And again, the alternative, I guess, is important. I mean, do you think it's pretty important to do you think if it's a fractured field and DeSantis stumbles a bit, and I don't know, something happens in Florida, and as he's trying to govern, and he looks, for some reason it doesn't come off well, do you think that helps Trump a lot, or does that sort of doesn't matter that much for the first half of 2023 or the first 9 months, and the coalescing would happen later anyway? I mean, how much should one be watching closely how DeSantis does early on, do you think?
I think we need to be watching very closely how DeSantis does, as well as how the other alternative candidates do. Trump's ace in the hole is winning a third of the vote in winner-take-all primaries and having multiple candidates splitting the non-Trump vote. It's 2015 and 16 all over again. So I think that's exactly the kind of scenario that could lead to a Trump renomination.
So if it's kind of important in the summer, let's just say of 2016, fall of 2016, of 2023, that there is or isn't a coalescing behind DeSantis, or maybe DeSantis and one or two others, and a sense that they might also get out, if maybe there's room for one like Larry Hogan, never a Trump person, but Asa Hutchinson, but that the sort of serious alternatives to DeSantis either don't run or look ready to yield to him, or DeSantis doesn't turn out to be the alternative and someone else is. But you think that's, you think if we have this conversation in October, this time, let's just say in 2023, and there are a bunch of people running and they're all kind of raising money and it's very unclear which of them is the real alternative to Trump, that's a very good thing for Trump.
Yes, that's the way he gets renominated.
And on the indictment, just to finish up on that, I'm very struck by your view, which I tend to agree with, but I think it's a bit contrarian that after an initial rallying to Trump, maybe voters get a little queasy about the idea of a guy who's literally going to, be on trial, presumably. At some point in 2023 or 4, I guess. These things don't take forever once you get indicted, even if you try to stall them. So how you think that could be a problem for Trump?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. I think so. Anything that feeds the maybe Trump voters another reason to look for an alternative, I think is a very important consideration.
And if DeSantis, which he won't, but decides, for some reason, has a family situation or something that he's not going to run, we should just spend a minute on sort of the other obvious or not so obvious possibilities. Do you have any particular sense of the other one? Who else is plausible?
Oh, there are a great many alternatives. Nikki Haley was very popular in South Carolina and did a very good job as governor of South Carolina. She was a real leader there. Asa Hutchinson did a fine job as governor of Arkansas and has talked about running. There are all kinds of others. Chris Christie and Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence. There's a long list of people I think who would like to jump in. Tim Scott's another one who's very popular in South Carolina. So I think there are a number of very credible alternatives if they want to throw their hat in the ring. And I think a number of them will get a serious look by Republican primary voters.
Do you think there's a distinction between those, like Pompeo, DeSantis, Youngkin, I would say, who have been accommodating to Trump and never really clashed with Trump in any serious way, as opposed to Pence, let's say, who, of course, stood up to Trump on January 6th. Or I'd say Governor Kemp in Georgia, who should be on this list, you would think, because reelected by a big margin.
Youngkin and Kemp both should be on that list.
But Kemp stood up to Trump in 2020 on the election. And I wonder if that's a disqualifier. I mean, it could be a qualifier. You'd think in a normal world, frankly, but I'm struck how little he's mentioned. And I think that's because just he sort of would be a bridge too far certainly for the 35% who are always Trump, and maybe even for some of the ones who want to make sure the party could be stitched together and we don't need to pick a fight with Trump and all that, right? I mean,
yeah, the sweet spot seems to be that you've never gotten into a public fight with Donald Trump, but you're not Donald Trump.
And does Trump allow that sweet spot to remain a sweet spot? I think that's one of the things people don't think enough about. It's not like Trump just sits there passively for a year watching a consolidation to DeSantis or something else, right? How much trouble can he cause to try to prevent, to in a way pick fights, which he might think help him, because there are people who don't want to nominate someone who's in a fight with Donald Trump.
Right. We'll see. I mean, he's already tried to go after Ron DeSantis. And the reaction was very negative among Republicans. It was like, wait a minute, we like this guy, DeSantis, don't you go criticizing him. And by the way, don't go taking shots at our leading candidates just a few days before a midterm election when they're up for reelection. I mean, he tried to do it with DeSantis and it blew up in his face. So we'll see if that happens with other people. But that's also an indication. We were talking about things to look for at the start of the conversation. That's also an indication of how strong Trump is or is not. If by taking shots at other popular Republicans, if that creates a backlash and doesn't go over well, that's also an indication of a weakness in the Trump support.
Yeah, that is striking. And I now he may, of course, decide to blow up everything in 2024, just anyway, no matter whether he's strong or weak, and I guess, attack everyone and threaten to run as an independent and so forth. But as you say, the fact that he did it that early, I think people took that as a sign of weakness, and maybe they were right to do so. Or maybe Trump's being his kind of cunning self and realizes he has to weaken these people early. I mean, he can't just sit around and, think that others are going to do the work for him.
Well, that assumes that his attacks actually weaken them rather than strengthen them.
Yeah, I guess we just don't. Well, I guess we know in the sense that DeSantis won by 20 points, right? And it doesn't seem like there's any diminution of donor enthusiasm for DeSantis or whatever.
Right, exactly.
So it sounds to me like you do think Trump has been weakened since we last spoke, because of the midterms, really.
Well, I don't know that you can go through a midterm like that with your MAGA endorsed candidates losing across the board. I mean, even Carrie Lake, who is a very polished, very attractive candidate, loses to Katie Hobbs, who's not, by any measure. If Katie Hobbs can beat Carrie Lake in a swing state like Arizona, that tells you the limitations of the MAGA message as clearly as any other example will do. So I don't know how you could come away with the midterms thinking that Trump will strengthen. I do sense that he is weakened. The question is, weakened by how much? And what do the always Trump people do in the wake of that midterm election? There's no question that Republicans left a lot of seats on the table, and we would control the Senate and a comfortable margin in the House were it not for Donald Trump's intervention. So how much does that weaken him? We're going to find out. But I can't believe he's not at least a little weaker now than he was when we last talked in August.
No, and people like me have been burned so often by Trump's strength among Republicans and the persistence of that. Probably maybe have gone too much. Maybe we're too much, fighting the last war, learning lessons from the last war. And I've kind of assumed, well, Trump just edges away from the election denial stuff, which I do think hurt. I mean, there's no question that voters distinguish between election deniers and even pretty conservative, and even in some respects, extreme Republicans or demagogic Republicans. But if they weren't full-out election deniers, they really were willing to tolerate a lot that they wouldn't from the election deniers. And maybe I've sort of assumed, well, Trump can edge away from that. He just sort of says, well, look, I think it was stolen, but I'm not even going to bother with that. That's the past. Sort of what he did with birthers in 2015, 16 with the birther stuff on Obama, and just, move on. But maybe that's not quite so easy. Maybe that's so much part of his brand, so to speak, that he can't quite put that behind him in a way that it was a more fluid situation in 2015, 2016, perhaps.
Right,
I don't know.
right. Yeah. It's interesting to me that Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin, for that matter, have never said the 2020 election was stolen. They've talked about election integrity, and DeSantis has put out an election integrity task force. But if you look what they've said carefully, they've never said the 2020 election was stolen. And that tells me something as well.
Do you think, maybe final question on the Republicans, how about elected officials? Part of me thinks, until an elected official stands up and says, no, it shouldn't be Trump, it should be X, or at least it shouldn't be Trump, real elected officials, senators, members of the House, governors, not just one or two random ones, that it's not much, that he's pretty strong, but maybe they just keep quiet for 9 months. I mean, in a normal off year, in the odd year, which we're going to be entering in a month, you would look for indications of strength among, let's say, if you were the governor, I'm making this up, but I'm sure it's true, that Bush in 1999, I'm sure was endorsed by all or most of the Texas congressional delegation, sure. Right? Sure. I mean, that was sort of a sign that they were with him. And then other people said, oh, I'm with him too. And, there were probably X number of House members and some senators and former, obviously he's Bush, so it was a kind of weird, different situation, but former big shots who were with him and so forth, and well-known donors. I guess, would one expect, are 15 House Republicans from Florida going to endorse Ron DeSantis, or are they just going to keep their head down? I mean, is that an indication of anything, or is it not the right way to think about it because that was then, and this is just such a different world that everyone's just going to? Well, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Well, you got to put yourself in their shoes, an elected official. What's the upside versus what's the downside of sticking your nose in that at this point? My sense is that most of them will stay relatively quiet unless there is a significant upside. And there may be a significant upside for elected officials in Florida, for example, to endorse DeSantis. But for people who are not from Florida, they've got to make a calculation. Basically, they got to try to figure out who's going to win and try to get on their side earlier on. Early is better than later. But I think there may be some of that, particularly in Florida and Virginia for Youngkin, for example. But beyond that, it's more a matter of just a self-preservation calculation.
So don't expect, or at least it would be a little bit of a surprise to you if whole bunch of governors or donors or got together and said together it shouldn't be Trump. Either it should be X, it shouldn't be Trump, or just it shouldn't be Trump. It should be one of the other candidates. That's probably a bridge too far for.
Well, I'm not saying it can't happen. If it does happen, though, it is a major indication of Trump's weakness.
Yeah, so that would be something to really look for.
Oh yeah.
It's not just Chris Sununu. I mean, I don't mean to minimize these people, but people who have been pretty outspoken already, the Chris Sununu's of the world, but that it sort of mainstream conservative and people who were reasonably supportive of Trump in the past, if they start to jump ship, you think that matters?
Oh yeah, that's a definite indicator that Trump is seriously weakened.
And it would matter, presumably, even with some of the Trump loyal voters, and certainly with the in-between voters,
sure,
the maybe Trump voters. And I suppose if it comes to an actual primary, I guess it will probably, and you'd expect to see the kind of split we saw in 2016, college educated, much less for Trump, non-college for Trump.
Oh yeah. And then, I mean, that's a major dividing line now, not just in the Republican Party, but in the country.
Yeah. I mean, it will be something. We've really never been. I mean, I feel like we've been through a few of these, and I think there are some things to be learned. I think the Bush 99 example is very interesting, but we just have not had this situation, right? I mean, we don't really know what in the real world, what does it look? I can't even myself quite conceptualize it. I mean, what does the New Hampshire primary look like, or South Carolina with Trump and DeSantis and well, we saw in 2016, I guess, but he wasn't then, of course, ex-president, and so
Right. It's a totally new world. We've never had anything quite like it, because we've never had anybody quite like Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a very true point. Okay, Democrats. Unless there's anything else we should be saying about the Republicans here. I mean, they have a choice to make too, don't they? Or not? Are we just in their normal? Of course, the incumbent gets renominated, and that's that. And stop thinking about it.
Well, most incumbents aren't 80 years old either. 2/3 of Americans don't want Donald Trump to run. 2/3 of Americans don't want Joe Biden to run. And I wonder what it would say about confidence in our political system if it comes up with those two choices again, when 2/3 of the country would like different choices.
I mean, obviously, those 2/3 are overlapping groups. I mean,
right. Of course, they're overlapping
2/3
groups.
Is the other party, but it's a lot. It means you don't get to 2/3 without a lot of members of your own party not wanting.
Exactly. That's the point. I don't think Joe Biden and his team ever fully understood why they won the election in 2020. I think they thought that they were elected to be a transformative president like FDR or LBJ, whereas in reality, they were elected, in Abigail Spanberger's words, to be normal and stop the chaos. That's why they were there. And they tried to be transformative, and it blew up in their face. They would have been better off understanding why they were there in the first place and governing from that perspective. I think the Biden administration and perhaps the president himself may very well misread the result of the midterm elections. They think the Democrats had a relatively better year than expected because of Joe Biden's leadership and because of his policies. The fact is that the Democrats had a reasonably good year in spite of, rather than because of, Joe Biden. His job approval is still below 45. His policies were not that important in the election. What was important is that Republicans nominated a bunch of weak, MAGA-aligned, election-denying candidates, and voters voted against those candidates, not necessarily for a Democratic agenda. And so if he understands why Democrats had a relatively better midterm than normal, it will help inform a reasonable decision about whether to run again. There are a number of credible Democratic alternatives out there. And my sense is that if Donald Trump looks weaker, then Joe Biden is less likely to run for re-election. And if Donald Trump looks stronger, Joe Biden is more likely to run because he believes he beat him once and he can beat him again.
I mean, based on my limited conversations with people pretty close to Biden, I think that he really believes. I mean, that he beat, of course, he's right that he beat Trump, and that would beat him again, which is a question. And he's the only one who could beat him again, which is a bigger question in my mind. But you can talk yourself into that if you're the one to beat him, right? So, and no one can really prove it otherwise. I mean, you could do some polling, I suppose, and show that Gretchen Whitmer matches up just as well against Trump. But it's an interesting point that you make. I mean, there's a weird relationship with these two invisible primaries now, or invisible pre-election years in 2020. What happens in each party in 2023, which is if Trump looks weaker, the case for Biden running as an 82-year-old looks weaker, right?
Exactly.
Including to Biden, presumably. I mean, my sense is Biden world is not very receptive to the message that he shouldn't run. I think most Democrats don't want a primary challenge to Biden, so that presumably doesn't happen unless he looks much, much weaker. But it is striking. I saw one poll after the election that's continued to show, I think, a majority, certainly a plurality of Democrats don't want Biden to run again. I'm not sure that the huge sigh of relief at the election returns has translated into, great, let's do 4 more years with President Biden. I think they want 2 more successful years of President Biden. And I do think the Biden people haven't thought through, but easy for me to say, I mean, how successful he could look after 4 years and be. I mean, to be fair, after 4 years, he did stabilize the ship. We got out of COVID. He's done pretty well in foreign policy. We might have some real successes in Ukraine or conceivably Iran or elsewhere in terms of liberal democracy, freedom around the world. The economy will get through inflation, presumably will be okay at some point. And he got some Democratic type programs through that, Who knows if they'll work or not, but whatever. But he has legislative accomplishments. He's not like he's without accomplishment. I mean, that's a pretty good record, and they don't seem to sense, as much as I think they might, how much at risk they'd put that by running again. I mean, he could lose. He could have a miserable second term. Things could go south. You know what I mean? But people, of course, incumbent presidents tend not to think that way, I guess. I don't know. I mean,
they've got the example of Nancy Pelosi stepping aside at the same
wonder about
age.
That.
And you get the sense that the Democrats nationally think it's time to pass the torch to a new generation, in JFK's words, some half century ago. And there are a number of Democratic governors out there with strong records. I happen to be a fan of governors running for president. I think they tend to make better presidents overall. There are a number of governors worth looking at. I mean, Jared Polis seems to be popular in Colorado. I'm not sure how much his sexual orientation is a drag. I do know that attitudes about gay marriage have dramatically changed over the course of the last 20 years. The smartest guy they've got is Pete Buttigieg. I mean, the smartest guy in terms of framing a message and articulating a message in a way that doesn't seem threatening to a lot of voters in the middle. But I don't know if America's ready for a president who kissed his husband on a public stage. I don't know. But it's not like the Democrats lack for some capable people out there who could step up and run in the event that Joe Biden doesn't. I do think one of them is not Kamala Harris. She didn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses in 2016, and there's a general sense that she's just not up to the job. But I think there are a lot of other Democrats who might present a more credible alternative case in the event that Biden doesn't run.
I mean, you haven't been involved in Democratic primaries, and nor have I, really, except a tiny bit in 2020. But I mean, as an analyst, I mean, how strong would Harris be, though, as the sitting vice president? And when I talk to some people on the outside, journalists, I would say more than actual Democratic operatives. Oh, Bill, you don't understand how strong Kamala Harris would be as both the incumbent and as the first black woman, obviously, to be vice president. How could you deny her? The Democrats have such an identity politics party. I've got to say, when I talk to actual Democratic operatives, they don't seem to think that much. And they just think, look, it's just going to be a race if Biden says he's not running. And it'll be like 2019, 2020. And she didn't do that well then. And why would she do that well now? And Buttigieg gets to run, and Polis gets to run, and Whitmer and Shapiro get to say, one of them at least, maybe both. Shapiro, maybe not so much because it's his first term, not a second. I won in the key swing states, and I can actually win the presidency in 2024. I mean, I don't know. So what do you think about, on the other hand, there's a long history of vice presidents getting the nomination, either as sitting vice presidents, if the president's not running or is finishing his 8 years, or even 4 years later, as with Mondale, and then with Biden, obviously, in 2020. So what about the strength of the vice presidency and the strength of Vice President Harris as a candidate?
Well, she'll clearly be a significant candidate should she run, just by virtue of all the things you just said. But I just think that she is on the ticket because of George Floyd's death. I think had it not been for George Floyd, you would probably have had an Amy Klobuchar or some other woman on the ticket with Joe Biden. And she's just not that good at explaining what she believes. I remember watching her try to explain her healthcare plan to a CNN journalist and getting herself all tied in knots. And I remember myself thinking, listen, just let Pete Buttigieg explain your healthcare plan. He could do a lot better job explaining your healthcare plan than you could explaining your healthcare plan. And a few more interviews like that, and I think many Democrats are going to decide they need to look elsewhere.
I mean, I guess candidate, you and I just discussed this the other day. Candidate quality matters, right? That's one lesson of this election. Yeah, well, I'll talk about that a bit, because everyone's so much sort of the other way these days, and not in a foolish way, but people look at the numbers, and demography matters the most, and these states follow the presidential pattern, and you can have some pretty mediocre candidates win if they're red candidates, Republicans in a red state or Democrats in a blue state, and so forth. But talk a little bit about, at the presidential level, why that if that is different, why that's different. I mean,
well, candidate quality matters even in a heavily polarized age. It may not matter to the hardcore Democrats or the hardcore Republicans, but it matters to those who aren't totally locked into their political parties, even if they lean one way or the other. And given how close our elections are, particularly in these swing states, it's the candidate quality that determines the outcome. Whether it's Arizona or Georgia or Virginia or any number of other places. Pennsylvania is a great example, Michigan. Bad candidates are hard to carry across the finish line unless they happen to get the Republican or Democratic nomination in deep red or deep blue states. Then the tide will carry them. But in any kind of competitive state, candidate quality matters. It matters especially at the presidential level. You're talking about a man or woman of enormous worldwide influence. And people sort of understand that. They can make a huge difference in the direction of the country and the direction of the world if they're the American president. So I think people are going to evaluate the capability and worthiness of anyone who pretends to run for president of the United States.
Yeah, and you're making the point that candidate quality matters even in general elections where presumably 80% of the vote is kind of locked in, right? Or 80, 90% maybe.
Sure.
And I think that's we saw that this past election. In primaries, even more so in the sense that the candidates mostly agree on most issues. You know, it's not like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, one of them is pro-life and the other is pro-choice, or what is pro-whatever, you know what I mean?
Right.
They're going to be. So in that case, I do think people sort of, we're so used to the polarization and the red-blue stuff, and maybe Trump, non-Trump is the only dividing line, that we've sort of forgotten just the degree to which in a real open primary, you know, Buttigieg went from 0 to 25% in Iowa and New Hampshire. Kamala Harris went from looking like, in a way, a very plausible nominee. People forget this in the middle of 2019, early 2019. She announced, it was a very good announcement speech. Remember this? A big crowd in Oakland in February, I think, of 2019, and then not making it to the starting gate. So, and we discussed 1999 and stuff. So, and McCain went from nothing to, you know, a genuine challenger to Bush. So, yeah, I think it's really an important point that people do. And I make this mistake too sometimes. Then you look at people's resumes and you say, well, if you're governor of a big state, then you know, or a governor who's won once or twice. But running for president is different from winning an open race, maybe in a primary for governor, or certainly being reelected governor, though that's useful, better than losing. But I don't know. I do think that's a very important point, that the voters aren't going to say, well, she's vice president, therefore we have to nominate her. Or nor will they say, incidentally, Gretchen Whitmer won an impressive reelection in Michigan, therefore we have to renominate her. I mean, I think there will be, on the Democratic side, maybe not on the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, debates and interviews galore, and people will evaluate.
Yeah,
right.
You're exactly right. And that's a critically important point. Lamar Alexander used to tell a story that going from running for statewide office like governor to running for president of the United States is like going from 8th grade basketball to the NBA. That it is a totally different level of scrutiny, of pressure, of competition, that it is a huge, huge leap to go from statewide to national office. And you're making that point very effectively, I think.
No, that's interesting. And I mean, now, if you're sitting vice president, you're used to the national scrutiny and so forth, and you've been vetted. So I mean, it's a little different maybe, but yeah, no, it will be interesting to see. And I guess the same true on the Republican side for all the DeSantis talk. We don't really, I mean, it's impressive to be reelected by 20 points in Florida, obviously, but we don't really know. It's been a pretty controlled environment for him in Florida. And once he got through that initial primary, which was tough, where he won really in an upset, but Trump helped him right. Against Adam Putnam. So
I mean, the big unknowns are candidates and the candidate quality and how they run their campaigns, and events that haven't happened yet. And we can't possibly get any kind of reasonable judgment without knowing either one of those two things at this point, sitting here in 2022.
But you think, I mean, if Biden wants to be the nominee, if he runs, and assuming some, no disastrous, obviously, health event or whatever, he is the nominee, I suppose. I mean, or would someone say at some point in the summer of 2023. Look, with all due respect, we've done a great job. We love you, but time for generational change. I sort of had the instinct that maybe that wouldn't be as suicidal as everyone thinks, but everyone does think it would be suicidal for someone to stick his head up that way. So maybe I'm just wrong about that. I don't know.
It's hard to imagine a sitting president not winning renomination if he really wants it. I mean, we got the example of LBJ being essentially run out of the race in 1968. But, you know, I did Strom Thurmond's last race for Senate when he was 94. Wow. And his opponent ran a fabulous ad with a bunch of elderly people sitting around in rocking chairs on the porch of an old folks' home. And the money line was, Strom, we love you, but it's time for you to come on home. Strom Thurmond won re-election.
But senator is different from president.
Yeah.
You know, you want a senator who will vote right, and you don't need him to be super on top of his game. Whereas that's what I do. We just don't know. I mean, Reagan, you know, I don't remember 84. I wasn't around. I was teaching. I mean, at the Kennedy School, so wasn't following, you know, the way you and I would these days, perhaps the campaigns, and didn't have access to internal polling. I have the impression that first debate hurt Reagan in 84. Now he was,
it did. Yeah.
And it was a moment of like, geez, this thing could just fall apart, and then he stabilized the situation. Right. So it's not as if voters are capable of thinking, I'm sorry, you're just not up to it. Now it would have to be something like that with Biden, not just, I think, the little stumbles we've seen on so far, you know.
Right.
But you say events do matter, and who knows, right? It's so that's awfully interesting. So finally, I'll frame this in sort of a bigger way. I mean, I'm so struck by the current moment because on the one hand, it feels like everything is uncharted waters. 80-year-old president, Trump, ex-president, you know, the Trumpism as a force in the Republican side. Democratic side looks more standard in a way, but some new things there too, obviously. So much emphasis on diversity and so forth. And then the polarization, but then but also one has the sense that, which we haven't seen before, which maybe that breaks up and is kind of makes things less predictable. On the other hand, in a sort of political sciencey way, if someone gave you the results of 2016, 18, 20, and 22, state by state or intrastate or polling, exit polls and analysis by educational level and ethnicity and so on, things haven't changed. I mean, we've had 4 elections that are pretty, you know, close to each other. I mean, with small changes at the margin, obviously very important ones from 2016 to 2020, and very few states in play. So in a certain way, people could say, well, you guys are having fun talking about all this variance and unpredictability and changeability and contingency. But you know what? In a certain way, it's like we're in a very stable, beneath the surface somehow, we're in a very stable environment. I mean, so which is it? Or both things are true, sort of, right? I don't know.
Well, both things are true. The longer term forces create the background against which candidates run for office. And those longer term forces, particularly the deep-seated polarization that affects our politics right now, determines a whole lot of the outcomes. But it doesn't determine all the outcomes, because the shorter term forces, the candidates who run, the campaigns they run, end up mattering at the margins, and we make an awful lot of the decisions about winners and losers at the margins. Those longer-term forces would not have told you what happened in Arizona. They would not have told you what happened in Pennsylvania, particularly the difference between the governor and the Senate races there. They would not have told you that Ron DeSantis was going to win Florida by 20 points, and Marco Rubio would have won Florida by 17 points. Those are a function of the candidates and the way they run their campaigns that are run against the background and the backdrop of the longer term forces that structure so many of the outcomes. So they both matter. And I don't think anyone would argue otherwise.
Do you think the longer term forces are pretty much locked in for now? Or could you have, some people have argued, I think somewhat intelligently, look, it's gotten so extreme, the polarization, it's sort of, I mean, we're heading to some sort of situation where it's unbelievably unchanged, it never changes, and it's incredibly locked in until it blows up and is locked in, you know? I mean, is there some but that You think that's unlikely over the next 2 years? I mean, you think that's a 20?
It will take a president, a different sort of president, to change that fundamental division. It'll take a Ronald Reagan type who attracts all kinds of blue-collar Democrats, for example. It's going to take a different kind of president that can break this sort of gridlock and deadlock in our parties. I don't know who that is. I don't know what kind of person it would take, except to say that we're likely to stay in the same sort of stasis with roughly even divisions between Democrats and Republicans nationally, unless some president comes along and figures out a way to break it.
Yeah, so I guess it's like the Soviet Union. It was all sort of, kind of stasis and ossified and whatever, creaky, but you needed Gorbachev to come and really shake it up. I mean, it's a funny analogy, but
exactly,
you need a kind of, from either party, I suppose, someone who's willing to, or able to, to really change things. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, I'm convinced that if one party could get control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency and not overreach and not do whatever their wingnuts wanted them to do, that they might actually govern for a while. But neither party has shown the ability or willingness to govern from somewhere close to the center. I'm worried House Republicans are going to do that. They were elected to fight inflation, to fight crime, and to do something about the border. They weren't elected to launch large investigations into Hunter Biden, that great threat to the republic, or ban abortion nationally. And I'm worried that the House Republicans are going to do exactly the same thing that the Democrats have done in the past, and that is govern from the wings, which will then create a backlash, which will then put the Democrats back in charge again.
And do you think so you think the House Republican performance matters somewhat for the presidential? I mean, you could also say that, Bush, well, was Bush hurt or not by Gingrich's overreaching? I don't know. I mean, that would be a question. But I think he had to distance himself from it, right?
Exactly.
He was a very disciplined candidate, and he had to say, I'm not like those people, and compassionate conservatism. And
yeah, exactly. That's what compassionate conservatism was all about.
And so you need in this case, a Republican presidential candidate who looks like the House Republicans, if the House Republicans behave the way we think they might, could hurt them, I suppose. And I suppose, of course, equivalent on the Democratic.
Exactly.
And of course, who knows? I guess it's not even worth going through all the things, recessions and foreign policy crises that could happen. But events matter. I guess that's what events
matter a lot.
Yeah, and we're a long way from the first.
Let's keep in mind that the vast majority of voters are not at the extremes. I think we've talked about this before. I mean, the number one category ideologically among American voters, according to Gallup, is moderate. That's the number one. There's something like 16% of the voters who are either very far left or very far right. That's all, 16%, 85%, 84% of Americans are not on the extremes. And it helps to remember that when you're talking about governing.
And do you think one party is more, I don't know, a little better positioned to shrug off its extreme than the other, or are they both about equally at risk of being dragged?
Well, they both have very, very powerful wings. At least at this point, Joe Biden beat the more liberal members of his party, thanks to Jim Clyburn in 2020. But both parties have serious challenges with their extreme members trying to guide the agenda in a way that creates a backlash that then puts the other party in charge.
And the Republicans have Trump, which is a little different from
that's a different issue. Yeah,
that's Bernie Sanders, issue. Elizabeth Warren kind of question. But
exactly.
Interesting. Well, look, this has been anything we haven't discussed that we should. Anything else you'd tell people to watch for, look for?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of surveying the landscape. I wish we could be more definitive, but we're a long way away from a very, very significant presidential election. And
as we said,
candidates and events are going to have a huge determinant on how that turns out.
Yeah, I think maybe being not definitive is itself a good lesson and a good, hopefully something that people can keep in mind. But I do think, I'd say final point I'd make, I'm just curious on your reaction. Yeah, I think one thing that comes as we talk, the importance of 2023. I mean, one thinks, okay, the presidential year is the even year, 2024, but of course, so much will be set up by a year from now. We're talking about November 28th. So let's say just after Thanksgiving of 2023. And so much will happen in 2023, and some of it will happen behind the scenes and semi-invisibly, and some of it visibly, and some of it on the Hill, and some of it among, in Florida, and some of it among candidates. But I think that's, for me, is one big takeaway of this discussion.
You're exactly right. 2023 is a very, very important year, particularly for presidential politics.
It could be a pretty crazy year, huh?
You think?
I do. You do. Whit Ayres, thank you very much for joining me again for this very thought-provoking discussion.
Always a pleasure, Bill, and really enjoy being with you.
And I enjoyed it too. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.